What is up, Asymmetry? How y'all doing? Every time that I work with my students at Mirai, I am always amazed at how much I take away from our collaboration and interactions. I mean, yes, people come here to study with me, but the byproduct of working together with such talented individuals that are dedicated to pursuing bonsai at the level that we're trying to execute the art form with at Mirai means that I get to meet a lot of really freaking fascinating, motivated, and super gifted people from across the world. And it's been one of the greatest unknowns that I've experienced from what we've tried to do here. And one of these individuals that continually stimulates just like an incredible amount of diverse thought and concept is my long-term student, Ryan Clumpner from San Diego. Ryan is a brilliant individual, has from the very beginning had so many incredibly interesting perspectives and ideas. And as I've watched him weave his way through life and form his own fabric in the journey that we're all on, I'm constantly being challenged to really think about things from a different perspective and in a different way. And I just value his presence in my life immensely. On this particular journey to Mirai for Bonsai Camp, RC presented me with this idea of third nature, which I've never heard of. And frankly, even as I make this intro, I am feeling some degree of rage or disagreement in my deep soul, which I'm going to have to think about and look at that and figure out why I find it to be something that causes that kind of reaction. But as he brought it up to me this morning over coffee on the day after classes ended, right before he went to the airport, I was like, RC, stop right there. We're going down to the studio and we're going to record whatever this discussion becomes because I've never heard of this, but I have a lot of thoughts about the immediate idea that you've proposed to me, and who knows what's going to become of it. And what became of it was just a really thought provoking conversation that I think is right in the sweet spot of what we all wrestle with as we are aware of the natural environment through our connection to bonsai, and we constantly in our daily lives and through the bonsai endeavor are challenged by the potential impact and footprint of what we're doing through living, through existing, and through pursuing this art form. Anyways, I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to this very brief but very intense thought exercise that may or may not have value and might potentially make us sound like esoteric assholes, but it also might open the door to some ideas that maybe have something constructive to contribute at some point now or in the future. And for myself, I'll be thinking about it. Enjoy, y'all. Put that up to your kisser. Put that right up smack dab to your kisser.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah. Yeah, the bentonite for the pond thing is like totally radical. I like it because I'm not super into like these solutions that are gonna time out.
Yeah.
Over the course of time. Like,
Yeah.
oh, a pond liner is gonna last you 12 to 15 years. Well, does that mean I have to move the 10 to 12,000 pound boulders that I'm gonna set on top of it? That seems stupid.
Tear it all apart. Yeah.
Like, what are we doing? Let's see here. Okay, so did you set an alarm?
No.
You better set an alarm so that I don't make you miss your flight. We had to run down here because RC and I were talking about something that I've never heard of, and it's a Saturday morning after classes, which is typically when Mr. Ryan is at his most brain dead. And then RC came up for coffee before he left because we just had a fantastic 3 days of bonsai camp at Mirai. And I don't know. What are you talking about?
Um, so I've been thinking a lot about third nature, which someone in the art world explained to me as a theoretical construct that I hadn't considered. Third nature is the idea that first nature is untouched wilderness, and second nature is the human spaces that involve natural processes, farms, parks, cities, houseplants, etc. And then third nature is this in between space that pulls on both of those things and doesn't fit neatly into either. And the more I thought about it, it's really an underpinning concept behind bonsai in many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. The
Um,
moment you said it and I looked up the definition of it, I was like, well, this is interesting because we also had the discussion on our way out of dinner on Thursday where I was telling you about those theories that I had listened to Azuma Makoto talk about in his perspective of his body of work, like putting these bonsai in these submerged aquatic environments or launching them into outer space, and how human plus nature creates something greater than nature. And then I saw Taiga Urushibata also had a similar like theology written down in front of, like, I don't know where that existed for him. His tree was on display in a public space, and that was part of his explanation of bonsai. And I was just like, what are we talking about here? And then when you brought this up, I was like, well, we gotta, this this needs to be something that we dig into a little bit here.
yeah, I think that it it conjures up for me ideas about the places that nature is reclaiming that have had human
Mm-hmm.
presence. If you think about a surface parking lot that is abandoned and the way that nature progressively steps in. First, you have the plants that exploit the cracks in the pavement and start opening it up. And then you have the second wave of plants that need a higher water presence that come in behind that and start filling in the gaps where the water
Mm-hmm.
can reach in. And then just that whole progression, that to me is a little bit more of a direct connection to where we're at as a human species in our relationship to nature,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that both kind of conflicts with what we're doing in bonsai and is also at the core of it.
Like explains it to a degree,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, even if you just look at the traditional ceramics that are dominant in traditional bonsai, I mean, those are functional stoneware
Mm-hmm.
that have been modified and adapted, and you have first nature, wilderness, untouched wilderness, being combined with it. But then there's also this idealized form
Mm-hmm.
that is really prevalent in bonsai, and I think that the idea with third nature, it it suggests that maybe we think twice about the nature of that idealizing that's happening
Mm-hmm.
and consider whether there's more to explore that has a different aesthetic that reflects the friction, the conflict that occurs
Mm-hmm.
between the human environment and the natural environment,
Sure.
instead of
And that,
sort of
what's that conflict though? Is it consumption? Is it alteration? Is it, lack of sustainability?
yeah, I think it's all of those things. I think it's also our confusion about how to relate to nature.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the conflict, I think, is really when you were talking about the ideas that have been expressed by Arushibata and others about the human engagement with nature, making it something above and superior
Yeah.
to first
Yeah.
nature.
Yeah. That's crazy to me.
Yeah,
Anyways.
that's where I think that there's more explanation about um, thinking of our involvement both as part of the natural process and in conflict with it at the same time,
Yeah.
and that there is a beauty to the friction between those things that doesn't have to be limited to an idealistic, almost mythological picture of what that relationship is. I think that that mythological picture of like the perfect bonsai tree and the perfect container and like the sense of peace with nature that it gives us is a little bit disconnected from the world we're living in right now
Yeah.
in a way that is unfortunate because I think people look at it as, like we've seen bonsai show up with aspects of industrial objects, industrial design, and it very clearly doesn't fit into the conventional model. But there is a beauty that comes with just recognizing what the interface between human civilization and nature is
Mhm.
in 2026
Mhm.
versus how we idealized it 100 or 200 years ago.
Totally. Totally. That's really interesting. The reason that I was like, RC, pause. I know you have to go catch a flight. We're gonna go turn on the recorder and we're gonna record this was because I was at Olson Kundig on a Monday, and they have a speaker series, and they invited me to be a speaker, which is like a total dream come true because I love their architecture so much. And the theme of their speaker series is under pressure, and I was like, I have been obsessed with the notion of entropy for the
Mm,
past like 3 years, right? Because of and it really started going back to your industrial tangent. It started with the Corten arches.
mhm,
Because once what I went through to design and build the arches was so above and beyond what I ever agreed to when the project started. And what it did to me to build those arches in the immediate was so devastating, because it just took so much. And the moment that they were up, although they have a longer lifespan than, say, a shade structure built out of wood, they are going to decompose at some point in time. So, this notion of tremendous energy input to get an unnatural level of organization, whether it's material production or creating a structured society, it's all the same to me, right? And then it immediately, when you hit peak organization, immediately starts to degrade and lose organization and will move in the direction of disorganization until it strikes the balance with the natural world. So when you're talking about like this notion of third nature, I'm drawn to, and this was my whole proposition to Olson Kundig, is like, I think the abnormal organization, whether we're predisposed to it or we have just become unknowingly and unaware of our unhealthy habit to do so. It's like, you can develop an unhealthy, we need to eat, but you can develop an unhealthy eating habit. Like, we need to organize as an organism. Every organism really does for longevity, but there's an unhealthy degree of organism or organization. And that unhealthy organization ultimately leads to the creation of problems that try to deconstruct it. And I think societally, a lot of the constructs that we see, whether it be gender or orientation or monetary power, all of these things that we're fighting right now that are causing problems, I think are a product of over-organization and an unnatural existence. So my proposition to Olson Kundig is, what does it look like for architecture to put people in a more natural position of being past the midpoint of organization into the slightly disorganized that nature sits at, and we revere and we go seek to find health and rejuvenation. Like, we're trying to find something that as an organism we can't define, and we go to this place that we're rapidly destroying in our just uncontrollable junky binge of organizing.
yeah.
Like, we're destroying this thing that we need, that we go to, that we actually inherently are looking
Hmm.
for answers from this thing, but we're doing something completely counter to it that's completely tearing it down.
Hmm.
So that then I started, like, when you started saying this, it like also complexly reminded me of David Krust's composition in the Artisan's Cup of the larch planted in the vacuum, and
Hmm.
Dave DeGroote's commentary on, sort of nature's going to overcome these man-made elements and organization over this much more prolonged period. And it's like this has been a theme that we've been wrestling with for a very long time, even in bonsai. We're like idolizing this thing and artificially overly organizing it in a smaller space to create a representation of something that exists right in front of
Hmm.
us. It's kind of ridiculous, but also at the same time, in order for longevity to exist inside of organization, i.e., societal comforts that provide the pillars of existence, food, shelter, etc., we are trying to capture, right, in the pure spirit of the origination of Penjing in China, we're trying to capture the profundity of those radical spaces in nature that remind us of these things that we cannot forget. And therefore, bonsai becomes the most important thing I think we can be doing right now.
The the impermanence is something that's jumping out to me from what you're talking about
Mm.
there. Going back to the arches, I mean that's kind of what you're describing. And bonsai is really uniquely positioned to contemplate impermanence.
Yeah.
It's I
You're
mean,
forced to. You're forced
yeah,
to.
yeah,
Your
and
hand is forced.
it's both the major constraint on the value of bonsai art, as compared to art that I wouldn't say is permanent, but changes at a much slower pace.
Sure.
And it also is such a phenomenal entry point into the exploration of impermanence and everything that goes with that. And impermanence really is this through line between, back to the first nature, second nature, third nature. What they all have in common is they're all subject to impermanence.
Hmm.
There's a change that is going to be occurring no matter what. There is no freezing anything. Architecture is really interesting to me because of its assumption that there is a permanence when we are building a structure, even though we intellectually know that nothing lasts forever.
Hmm.
When we're building structures, it is with the assumption that it is a permanent structure,
Hmm.
and that what comes out the other end will be fixed.
Hmm.
And then all of the maintenance related to that is about preserving it and maintaining
Absolutely.
it in a fixed state. And things like steel that rusts and decays, those I think are an embrace of architecture in a different way that allows the impermanence to be a focal point rather than a weakness or something that's being hidden. That intersects to me with bonsai in a way that I think in your material choices in the garden, for example, you're reflecting the fact that everything in the garden is changing at all times. The surface of the rocks are growing different mosses and
Right.
lichens. The wood is decaying. The metals are rusting. The trees are growing. Um, all of that is a constant change that's worth embracing and exploring rather than fighting and resisting and hiding.
Hmm.
The other thing that brings up to me a lot is the ideas of context and boundaries. And this is something that I think bonsai could do a lot more consideration of and exploration of where those boundaries are. And let me just kind of give you an example of different contexts of what I'm talking about with boundaries and context. A French salon has a particular order to it, which is the walls in the room and a vertical space that's usually very high. And then the paintings or other art organized in a way that uses most of the wall and arranges the things relative to each other in a value system, so that being in the room and looking at the wall full of paintings top to bottom, they are arranged in the whoever's doing the arranging is creating the curated experience for the person in the room. But the context and the boundaries are, it's going to be on the wall, it's going to be in the room, and a certain high percentage of the wall will be used by the paintings.
Hmm.
And then where they get placed is where the creativity goes. In the modern and postmodern art world, the context was very often the white gallery walls.
Yeah.
And the idea with both these things is that they essentially become invisible. That the white gallery walls was this reflection that we're going to take away the rest of the context and we're going to create a neutral vacuum to display the art on.
Right.
But now we've come to the understanding that, well, that in and of itself is just a different color of wall and a different
Right.
taste of how
It
you
it didn't,
arrange.
in fact, disappear. It
Yeah.
became a whole new context of this,
Yes.
sort of pompous perspective of art, right?
Which I'm sure was a freeing and liberating and boundary pushing thing the first time somebody stepped into a white walled gallery with minimal art, right? But now is a severely limiting constraint
Right.
on how we look at art and who art is meant for and how people relate to art and who's not invited to participate
Right.
and how intuitively understandable it is, and you might as just you can turn yourself around and leave if it doesn't make sense to you. But in bonsai, the bonsai display is probably one of the more rigid boundaries and
Yeah.
contexts.
Yeah.
And in art, for example, a huge amount of thought goes into the frames
Mhm.
traditionally, and the idea that you would have art with no frame or minimal frame. This is where a
Mhm.
lot of the current creative discussion is going on, is around, well, what are the possibilities of pushing the creativity into the context and the boundaries and altering those contexts and boundaries, and therefore changing how we interpret that maybe the same piece of art. And that's where, bonsai, like, for example, the prioritization of the front of the tree,
Mhm.
while it's a necessity from a design and a practical standpoint and a display standpoint, that is also something that is very limiting. And the moment you remove that constraint and you contemplate a tree from multiple angles and you place value on the perspective of angles that we historically might discourage the viewer from considering,
Mhm.
it's a different type of value expansion, right? It doesn't diminish the art. It actually moves the art into a larger discussion that would be more accessible to more people and provoke a different response.
Mhm. Mhm. I think it's interesting though, because like when you're using a living medium, the connection point to the design, it goes beyond the visual, right? Like if you have an inanimate sculpture that is sitting there capable of being viewed in 3 dimensions, and you don't have a commitment to a front or like a viewable perspective, that makes total sense, right? This is a 3 dimensional sculpture, and we say, okay, bonsai is art and bonsai is a 3 dimensional sculpture. But there's also this thing of like, well, when you see a human, you're going to try to look at their face, right? Like
Yeah, absolutely.
that face tells you everything about this relationship and engagement that you're going to have. And why does that matter? Why do we not treat human beings like 3 dimensional sculptures? Even though we dress, we put makeup and jewelry, we create all of this framing of this perspective that is most commonly going to be digested, right? And it's like, well, because we're going to have an interaction with another living organism that we have the ability to understand beyond something conceptual. There's a interaction, exchange of energy, a relationship that forms there. And I think in bonsai, it's like the clothing and the jewelry and the makeup, or the cologne, or the plucking of the eyebrows, or shaving, or whatever it is. Like all of that is the creation of this viewable angle to take in this intimate interaction with another living organism that does cross the boundary of what common art and sculpture of an inanimate object doesn't have to consider, you
Hmm.
know?
Yeah.
And so I do think that like our tools are limited, because, and the more interesting thing that you're saying to me is just this notion, which context has been from the beginning of Mirai, the backbone of what I consider, and it's like people are like, well, how do you display a tree without the confines of a traditional show? And it's like, well, you show it in a different context. And is architecture concept, is the natural environment context, is the structure that you put it on context, is the lack of structure, like all of these things are possible, but I still think we're super stunted because we haven't explored the tools yet. And that's really where this notion of like third nature, I'm not saying I accept third nature as a concept that I want to dig into heavily and start to really contemplate, because it at first blush have a little bit of like a new agey trying to reframe a timeless conflict
Yeah.
of us altering nature and trying to justify it and accept our place and basically
Hmm.
doing bad shit, right? Like that's kind of where it feels to me like we're like, well, now we're going to see ourselves as a less abusive
Hmm.
organism by looking at these spaces that are now in this realm of recovering from what we've fucked up,
Hmm.
And it's like, that just feels a little bit more like shirking responsibility of we've kind of destroyed this thing that's superior to us and that we depend on and need, but we continue to abuse,
Yeah.
It's like kind of, but at the same time, it is interesting because the more that we've built and the more that we've organized, we are going to have to learn how to deal with. And this is what I think is also fascinating, the state of population decline, the state of potential cultural pinnacling, and maybe seeing ourselves on the downward trajectory, possibly, or in the process of like any sort of improvement, there typically is a period of decline before we learn enough, come to realizations, explore and discover new things that we can do to improve upon that position, and we start the upward trajectory again. And I can just say, like, in my bonsai journey, anytime that I've made another tremendous leap, I've had to go through either a tremendous plateau or a decline before I get that next climb and elevation. And it's really painful and it can be fairly prolonged. And I think humanity is experiencing that. And I think it's being ushered in by a lack of control of what's happening climactically and environmentally as a result of or hand in hand with what would already naturally be occurring, right?
Hmm.
We can argue about that. It's pointless in my mind because it's happening whether we argue about it or not.
I'm almost thinking of these things personally as an expansion in the interpretation of the art form, not necessarily like a new limitation or a reframing entirely.
But where's the if you're talking
Yeah,
about an expansion, where is the room in that? Like
yeah, yeah,
I guess I'm
yeah,
looking for like
yeah.
where are you seeing the room and the space to do
S-
what?
So, for example, you are one of the most skilled and talented people in the world, I would say, when it comes to, in particular, the objective analysis of the design of a tree and the selection of the front and the angle.
Okay.
Every single tree in your garden, all 900 of them, you can take any visitor to the garden and walk them through what is gained by having this angle be the viewpoint. And at the same time, if you step back from the individual tree context and you look at the garden design that you've been building in its totality, and you treat the experience of walking into the garden as the experience of appreciation of bonsai in its own right, well, your garden is intentionally designed to be a progression of three-dimensional views of the
Mhm.
things that you're moving around and between and through and under and over and the rocks and the arches. And so that is where the expansion potential lies in my
Oh,
mind.
okay. Okay.
Or let me give you a more straightforward example would be the pieces that Michael Hagedorn has done where there is no ceramic body,
Right.
where it is mounted or hung or on a on a rod of some
Mhm.
sort, and the moss has grown all around it, and the boundaries are not what we are accustomed to seeing
Right.
in bonsai. So that's not like a loss or a degradation of the value of looking at the tree from the front. It's an expansion of the idea of what the tree is and the ideas it's supposed to provoke with us about where the nature starts and the human involvement begins.
Mm.
Um, the other, I mean, this is where I do think that the limitation comes a lot in the form of the exhibition criteria,
Yeah, for sure.
because that's where I think these other realms of exploration that have so much value and can be so provocative, where there's not space left for those things to happen.
Right.
And again, it's not to say that there's anything wrong with the traditional perspective on those things.
Not at all.
Simply that there's another frontier to be explored,
Yep.
that we should think about creating formats and environments where those things have the ability to be explored.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, when you started this visit particularly with this group, and you're a big part of that chemistry that happened the past 3 days, and occasionally, like I do as like being here all the time, I do have these magic moments of the right people at the right time under the right circumstances, creating a really radical maybe trajectory shift or maybe just a boost to the trajectory. And you guys have been a boost to the trajectory that we've taken at Mirai with the new garden build, really catalyzing far more than a garden build inside of my mind, right? But when you started saying it's super interesting that you're so committed to the front of this thing, which my value system is, I'm creating an interaction point for this organism and this living relationship. And you're like, yeah, but you're all offering in the context of your garden the ability to completely neglect that meeting point by allowing people to walk around this as if it is more of like a three-dimensional sculptural opportunity, and you're creating different contexts through the surfaces under, over, in, outside of. And I really thought that was interesting because I had not, sometimes when you're so close to it, you can't really get and pull out all of that DNA of what.
Forest for the trees.
Yeah, it's exactly, you're lost in it, and I am definitely lost in it. And here's the thing, I'm like gratefully lost in it right now because I've spent the past like 5 years after the vandalism just totally trying to figure it out, you know? And then I did something that was more intuitive than strategic. I mean, the idea kind of manifested, but more the garden build was such a free form expression. Every rock found its place kind of organically as the whole thing came together, and every bench found its height and location in response to just this feel. It was a feel that I was seeking, you know, and there were some parameters to it. It wasn't just so willy-nilly that it's like anything goes, because I had function that guided the design, but more than anything, like what felt so good about it was letting go and just letting the process sort of happen. And that is the addiction of creativity, is that creative process, you know?
Remind me the name of the artist you've been working with recently who does the metal and stone
Oh,
work.
Thomas Navarre.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so the two of you have a collaboration piece in the garden that I think is the most, like, hits the nail on the head when it comes to the discussion around third nature,
Mm-hmm.
which is the piece that is built with a dead tree.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really fascinating to me that, for example, it sits on the bench surrounded by trees that require water every day, right? And it's also an acknowledgement that, like, we all have dead trees, you know? We all have dead trees under our belt, in our gardens, you know, hidden somewhere in the back. And, like, the boundary and context question to me, I and when you were talking about, you know, the changing relationship of, you know, human civilization to nature and
Mm-hmm.
all the ways that we're messing it up and supporting it and all these other things, we could discard our dead trees into the back and moss will grow over it, and anybody that stumbled upon it would kind of be like, what is happening here? This is, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
this is a wild scene here. Like, I don't know how these got here. You know, there's some sort of human involvement going on, but they're also, you know, nature's, you know, reclaiming these. They're slowly returning to soil. And we could leave that completely out of our discussion and
Mm-hmm.
out of our contemplation,
Mm-hmm.
or we could find interesting ways to pull it in and not just acknowledge there's dead trees under our belt,
Mm-hmm.
and that's part of what got us here,
Mm-hmm.
but also find value in those dead trees themselves
Mm-hmm.
and provoke a viewer to consider what exactly the nature of our engagement with these natural organisms is,
Yeah.
in a way that is uncomfortable. And we lose a lot when we run away from the discomfort, when we burden ourselves with a lot of shame around the dead trees and therefore aren't willing to consider them. We're also losing the beauty of recognizing that we are part of that we are a part of nature. We are engaging with nature, and that engagement is complicated and dynamic and messy and fraught and beautiful, and there's something that is really profound in that to me, that you know, I think in the more traditional sense you would say, you know, that discussion occurs within uh, a really exceptional juniper,
Mm-hmm.
the interaction between live and dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be limited to lime sulfur bleach and a red live vein.
Right.
We could take that same concept that we put so much value into with a juniper and consider the same ideas and feelings that that is supposed to invoke in a wider array of manners.
Hmm. That really takes me back to, I think I was telling you about Thor's music that he was making in that town in
Yeah.
India where it's basically a town built around death and
Cremation. Yeah.
cremation, right?
Yeah.
And thinking about, and he was talking about just the wild amount of, is it time?
No.
Okay. He was talking about the wild amount of input making something creative under the pressure of an environment that is essentially dealing with like death, the
Yeah.
end. Um, and what does become of that? And the this is so dramatic, so like don't judge me for this, but I am just gonna say this, and this is really where the projects in the wild sort of like my I have not lost the desire to do the projects in the wild. I feel like the projects in the wild did answer the question that I went to ask, and maybe not maybe. I'm sure there are plenty of more questions to answer about that, but I don't have those questions anymore, right? I got what I needed from that, which was when I did the project in Central Park.
Mm.
I've never been to India. I've never been to this location of mass cremation. I have no idea what it would be like to make a tree under that pressure and context. But I have been to what I would consider to be a pinnacle of human organization. And the stripped down vapidness and lack of all of the experiences and the quality of the experiences that I had in the wild told me everything I needed to know in that juxtaposition of those projects.
Yeah.
That is not my space where I'm going to be my best self and make the most beautiful thing that I have the capacity to bring to life in the world or add my flavor to. But I also really just felt like it was like the major gesture of where maybe human organization had gone too far. And that was really what I needed to know. Like what happens to the work when I take it out of the environment that has organization to disorganization. And I saw what that was. And then it's like, well, what does that look like under different contexts? And then what happens when I go to the peak of organization? And the outcome of those projects is really why I'm at where I'm at now.
Central Park is a really interesting concept that I've thought a lot about.
I think it's insane. And I think the fact that everybody's like, what a gift. It's so great. It's this amazing thing. Somebody actually thought of it. And it's like,
So
what are you talking
there's
about?
also a real through line in what we were talking about earlier with in Bonsai the notion that there's a superiority from the human involvement
Hmm.
or hand on nature,
Yeah.
and that was really like Frederick Olmsted, the designer of
Yeah.
Central Park. I I see that very baked into all the work he did.
Hmm.
It was at this moment of industrialization and the Gilded Age, and there was this romantic idea that if he could dictate, exactly where everything went, that it would be superior to nature
Hmm.
itself. And some of the most interesting things about Central Park now, I think, are more related to the history of it.
Sure.
There
Yeah.
was uh, you know, uh, a black neighborhood that was leveled. I mean, that was the site selection was basically
Right.
which people could be displaced in order to build this.
Hmm.
And then all of these trees from non-native areas outside the range were brought in, right? And it's really incredible to look at now. But like your point about the thing that is just foundationally different between being at a high alpine old growth location as compared to the middle of Central Park. They're both beautiful in their own ways.
Yeah.
Personally, I would say it's a huge mistake to say that we improved upon nature with our
Just
involvement.
so
I mean, the
not.
best thing that we can do in my mind is to engage with it
Hmm.
and explore what that intersection looks like, but have a little humility about the fact that we're not separate and apart from it, and we're not capable of making something superior to nature itself.
I'm glad you took it here because yeah, you can wax poetically or you can pontificate cerebrally about all of this, and then it's like, yeah, okay, that's great. You're just talking out your ass about
Yeah.
these esoteric concepts. What the fuck is the point? And I do think, circling back to just this this notion of third nature that you presented me with this morning, is just another salve to put over the necessary self-reflection that we've all got to have, that like we are trying to find ways to justify devaluing and destroying nature, which is the thing that we need to be our best selves. And like, I think the whole concept of Central Park is a perfect tangent to third nature as ridiculous.
Hmm.
Ridiculous.
Hmm.
That's what I've come to. And it's and you know, it's like I think New York is amazing if you look at it from a human perspective of just like the human uh, predisposition to organize. That's a pinnacle moment of that, as is any great city, as is any great city where people, I mean, Tokyo is insane. The population density built on top of itself that works in camaraderie, you know, culturally, it's a pinnacle of human achievement, architecturally or infrastructurally. In terms of civil engineering, it is like at the top of like human engineering. And then if you give the opportunity for a fungal network to create a more efficient system there,
Yeah.
it does it in very short order and makes it far better, far more efficient, far more productive, far more of all of the positive things that we aspire to achieve in all of our organizing strategies. And we see, like, we really are, there is like a superiority to nature untouched by human beings
Hmm.
that we cannot lose sight of, and at some point are going to have to stop trying to justify and recognize, if we lose this thing, we are totally fucked.
The value in these theoretical frameworks, in my mind, and I'm glad you're kind of pointing out that it's really only as valuable as it adds something to our
It totally
experience
right.
around it. And another example, we've talked a lot about the old growth forests that end up in pulp mills being turned into toilet paper, right?
Right. Drop that little
And
optimistic nugget on y'all.
yeah, yeah, and the reality is, we can't just stop buying toilet paper.
No.
We can't. We can't dictate where it comes from.
Well, we
The
we
I mean,
we
like
could
me,
though. We
yeah.
could though, and maybe that's what we're
But like you and me
avoiding.
as individuals can't, declare it's not going to come from old growth anymore, right?
Right.
But what we can do as individuals is, and this is where the value of a theoretical construct comes from. Um, when we wipe our ass, we could take a moment to appreciate the the ancients, the ancients that are making our life possible, right?
Oh
that
no.
that like at least have a little reverence
J-
for the most mundane,
yeah.
out of sight thing that we can literally come up with in our personal lives, and have a little reverence for the role that nature is playing and how it reflects our engagement with nature. You can't put the tree back.
Yeah,
You
right.
could take a moment to think about what has gone into making our lives so convenient and clean and safe,
Wow.
and at least like we don't have to like weep over those trees. We can at least like have a gratitude and an
Yeah.
appreciation,
Yeah, that's interesting.
regardless of whether it is like the process that we would want to play out. It is the process that we're in.
I want to I'm going to have to think about that. I'm going to have to think about that. I've never had anybody offer that up as like, there's always this notion of like, oh, we need to be more sustainable, and then what does that mean? Reduce our carbon footprint, and then everybody's like, yeah, and life keeps going. I've never heard somebody say, just taking a moment in as you use the most industrialized, destructive products that make our life convenient, to actually think about where that came from and having some degree of appreciation for it being a way of somehow acknowledging what was lost to have that convenience. I've never thought about that. I
I,
appreciate that,
I,
and I don't
I
know how
would,
I feel about it, and I don't
yeah,
know.
totally.
I don't have much.
I would love Central Park to be full of old growth American chestnuts. Right.
Yeah,
I think that would be a vastly more spectacular place
yeah,
to visit.
yeah, for sure. Yep.
But that's not possible. And so the appreciation of Central Park, part of it is the recognition that that has been lost, and that what we have put here instead was the best we have to offer, even if it doesn't measure up. And we can appreciate that for what it is. We can visit Central Park without solely thinking about the families whose property was taken and the chestnut
Right.
trees that we doomed with blight. We can appreciate, and it actually makes what is there more beautiful to experience when you think about the loss and the sacrifice that went in to the story behind it.
Yeah, if that offsets the lessons that we could learn about how we shouldn't do that anymore, though,
Yeah.
that's where
Yeah.
I get off that train. So like
Yeah.
I feel you, and I'm all for the optimism, and also it's like there is a duality that has to coexist with all of these situations in the modern era, and that is,
Yeah, we
hey,
should probably all have a bidet.
yeah, maybe. I mean, although water is going to become the next
Sure.
limiting, it's like Colorado River doesn't reach the ocean. What are we going to do about that? But hey, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
I
That was
appreciate
fun.
it, RC.
Always
You always
enjoy
get the
it.
gears, going, and I appreciate you.
Glad to be here.
Right on, man.
Thank you, Ryan.